I want to thank Michelle Esser for her participation on the case panels, the case discussion panels today. She was absolutely awesome. I also want to let you know that you can vote at MedImmune, which is right adjacent to our display table. And if you vote there for the Alamo Breast Cancer Foundation, it will help provide money for next year's patient advocate program. And we would really appreciate if everyone would go over and do that. Well, I hope everyone had a productive, informative day at SABCS today. I am Dale Eastman. I'm Chair of Advocacy and Government Relations for the Alamo Breast Cancer Foundation and part of the Patient Advocate Committee that puts on this program. I am a 23-year breast cancer survivor. Thank you. Well, thank you for everyone who's attending tonight's mentor session. And we will have one more session tomorrow night at the same time, and we will also have food, so please come and join us. We would like to say thank you to those who provide funds for our program so that we can put this on for y'all. That is AACR, Amgen, AstraZeneca, the Avon Foundation for Women, Celgene, Genentech, Genomic Health, Julie Ann Carpenter Memorial Fund, Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation, Dr. Peter Rabden, and Dr. Sharon Wilkes. For the 10th year in a row, we are recording this meeting, and it will be available towards the beginning of February on the internet. And tonight, for the first time, we've never done this before, we are live streaming. Tonight's session will start with each mentor providing an overview of a specific session or sessions. Following the overview, we will open up the discussion for questions from the audience. Microphones are on each side here. To ask your question, please stand in the aisle and wait your turn. Please limit yourself to one question per turn. And remember, please, do not ask about your own experience with cancer, or because we may stop the question and go on to the next person in line. When moving about the room, please use the outer aisles only, because we're filming through here. And if your badge was not scanned on your way in, or if you don't have a badge, please visit the registration table at the end of tonight's session. Please remember that we are recording this session, and you may enter and exit the room using the door that you came in. Please set your cell phones and pagers to silent mode because the noise can affect the quality of the program. Please make sure to fill out your evaluation form and hand it in before you leave. We will have volunteers at the exit to take them up. Before I introduce the mentors for this evening, we would like to thank them for giving very generous We have 4 returning mentors, and we just thank you so much. And we also have a new mentor, so be nice to him. We want to remember that. Our returning mentors are Dr. Judy Garber, Director of Friends of Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Harvard Medical School, Cliff Hudis, Chief Breast Center. He's our new guy, okay? Chief Hudis, he's Chief of the Breast Center at Memorial Sloan-Kettering, and he's also President of ASCO. Virginia Calcomani is Associate Professor of Medicine at Northwestern University, Feinberg. And Hope Rugo is Professor of Medicine, Director of Breast Oncology and Clinical Trials at the University of Cancer San Francisco, Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. So with that, I'm going to let you start your hot topics. Oh, Steve
Yeah,
Shack.
yeah.
Oh my God.
Please introduce
Let me tell you, he's on the next page, I can't help it. Let me just tell you about Steve Shack. I think he was here at the very original one we had, and I think it was like about 16 years ago. Wow, amazing. Thank you.
Okay. I looked down the row and I asked who's in charge. They said you. I know that's not true. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this. You're going to hear, I guess, through the next little bit, updates from each one of the faculty members on one area that we thought was a hot topic for today, or from today. I'm going to pick one area which may have escaped your attention, but I think is both important in a practical sense because of the patients it can help, but also the way in which it illustrates the kind of translational scientific success we want to see. So there's an abstract right now that's being discussed in a poster discussion session from Tiffany Traina that's looking at an anti-androgen receptor drug called MDB-3100, also known as enzalutamide. This is a phase 1, so it's not the kind of result that you would ever call practice changing. It establishes a dose of the drug in women, which is the important part, and this will lead to a phase 2 study and maybe beyond in the months and years to come. So that's the simple take-home point, but now the question is, why do you care about this? In order to tell you that, I want to back up a little bit. We have targeted therapies for HER2-positive breast cancer. Lots of success here, and even a little bit of excitement about the possibility that we can afford to back off on treatment for that subtype of breast cancer. We have, of course, a century, ultimately, of targeted therapy for the estrogen receptor-positive breast cancers, that is ER and or PR positive. But triple negative, those left behind by exclusion, don't really, at least not historically, have established targeted therapy. Lots of exciting progress there, PARP inhibitors, and others that I think are poised to possibly become part of the quiver for us, but not yet ready. And so, looking at this, now about 8 years ago, a pre-medical student working in the lab of William Gerald at our place took about 50 breast cancers and in those days did a gene expression profiling. And what he found was a pattern of gene expression that looked the same as what you normally see in estrogen receptor positive breast cancers, but these cancers were estrogen receptor and progesterone receptor negative. So it's as if the pathway was turned on, but the receptor was not present. And he back-matched that pattern against a large number of potential cell lines and identified that there were breast cancer cell lines that were actually androgen receptor positive. And of course, androgen is the male hormone which drives prostate cancer. And these breast cancers had androgen receptor present and downstream signaling. He produced that retrospectively. This was later confirmed in several other groups, and indeed later when Chuck Peru and subsequent people looking at gene expression profiling broke out their subsets of breast cancer, a luminal AR subset was identified, which was this set. So what does it matter? Well, of course, if you have a triple-negative metastatic breast cancer, the palliative options today include chemotherapy. And the question was, could you in fact target and treat those cancers by going after the androgen receptor that was signaling? And so the next thing was laboratory experiments were done where it was proven that these cell lines were not driven by estrogen, but were driven by androgen, and that drive could be blocked with anti-androgen drugs. Very straightforward. So then we decided to look at bicalutamide, an old anti-androgen receptor drug that is widely used in prostate cancer. You may know it's by the name Casodex. It's been around for a long time. And the problem was there were no women who had been studied with that drug. So Tiffany Traina, my colleague, through the Translational Breast Cancer Research Consortium, ultimately concluded a clinical trial that proved that about 10 or 15% of women with triple-negative breast cancer have androgen receptor, and about 20% of them get a clinical benefit measured as no worsening of their disease over 6 months or response. And so what that meant was that for that small sliver of patients with what you might call an orphan disease, a much safer, much better tolerated palliative option was developed. You could never do a randomized trial for that cohort of patients, and that's the lesson that all of us have to think about in terms of the modern push to precision care. You're going to have to accept that a large phase 2 study might actually be practice changing when you can't launch randomized trials. So that's the background, and in fact, if you want to use bicalutamide to treat AR-positive breast cancer today, there is some evidence, and there probably won't be any more ever. And the worst that you'll do is give it doesn't work, but if you give it and it works, we're able to actually get some patients prolonged periods of high-quality disease control. So that brings me to the next part of this. In prostate cancer, there's a quest to find better and better anti-androgen agents. Abiraterone was recently approved. Some of you will be familiar with that drug. It's effective in lots of, or several settings, and an important addition in prostate cancer. And then more recently, this drug, MDV-3100, or enzalutamide, has been developed. It targets the androgen receptor in a different way at the molecular level, actually preventing its action at the nucleus in the cell. And so what Tiffany is presenting tonight is a phase 1 study, as I said, of that drug in women. The reason this is important is that enzalutamide, which was recently FDA approved for prostate cancer, is one of the few drugs in that disease that's been associated with a significant increase in overall survival. So if it had that impact in prostate cancer, there's a hope that it could offer the same in breast cancer. I'll just close by saying I presented this as a way of avoiding chemotherapy, this story, in triple-negative breast cancer, but there's actually a bigger part to it, which is that about 60 to 80% of estrogen receptor-positive breast cancers have the androgen receptor present. Its role there isn't so clear, whether it's a bystander or whether it's actually part of the pathogenesis of the disease, and we're trying to figure that out. So you will see in the next few years increasing studies that target AR in breast cancer. So thank you very much.
I left everything for you.
So I don't want to leave one thing unclear. Ed Benz would be very surprised to know that I was now the director of the Cancer Center at the Dana-Farber. I'm only the director of the Cancer Genetics and Prevention Program at the Dana-Farber. But we'll be clear. So I'm going to talk about Jack Cusick's presentation on the prevention trial. I don't think it's had a huge amount of attention, but it fits with the rest of the morning, or at least a large part of it that talked about aromatase inhibitors. And this was the IBIS-2 trial. So the history of this was that the Europeans have run a prevention trial called IBIS. IBIS-1 was tamoxifen against a placebo. IBIS-2 was the aromatase inhibitor against placebo. And the Americans ran similar trials, tamoxifen against a placebo in the breast cancer prevention trial, then tamoxifen against raloxifene in the STAR trial. And then there was a study that was really run by Canadians, but also included American sites and European sites, called the EXCEL trial. That was exemestane versus placebo. And exemestane is aromacin, so it's a drug a lot like the anastrozole or Arimidex that was part of this trial. So we had 2 trials for tamoxifen, the IBIS-1 and the breast cancer prevention trial, and we've now had 2 trials for aromatase inhibitors. And then we had the 1 trial that compared to SERMs, or tamoxifen and raloxifene. So where are we in prevention? So Jack trial, the IBIS-2, looked at the aromatase inhibitor anastrozole or Arimidex against placebo, and he showed, in the slides he had, apparently some were missing, he had very exciting results. They showed that ductal carcinoma in situ was reduced by 90%, so that's an activity. And breast cancer, invasive breast cancer, was reduced by 53%, and estrogen receptor positive breast cancer was reduced by 58%. And there was really no activity against triple negative disease or otherwise estrogen receptor negative disease. There was no decrease, but there was no increase. So this is exactly what you've expected to see with all of these trials now, with drugs that have been active in treatment and are taken to the prevention setting. And they're taken to the prevention setting because in all the treatment trials, you can show that you can reduce the risk of a second breast cancer, usually by about 50%. That's pretty impressive. And here are women who were at increased risk for whatever reason, family history and other risk factors. So the drugs work. So we sort of say, oh ho hum, couldn't we tell without doing big trials? But no. And I think among the most important things you learn from prevention trials is more and more about side effects, because people on prevention trials are even less likely to stay on treatment than people on treatment trials or people being treated. And we'll hear a whole section on what happens to people trying to take aromatase inhibitors for treatment. But in this trial, they showed, at least in their calculations, that most people stayed on the trial, although not all, of course. 72% stayed on the placebo, but 72% stayed on the drug, 68% on the placebo. And they estimated that only 10%, because so many people left the trial on the placebo, that only 10% of the side effects really were related to the drug, that a lot of people left for reasons not necessarily because of direct side effects from the drug. And that makes sense, we'll see. They looked at fracture risk. Remember, these drugs cause bone loss, and they showed a 10% difference between people on the aromatase inhibitor and people on placebo. They had no real difference in hot flashes. They had a little more vaginal dryness, and I don't know exactly how they measured that, but that's what they reported. And then they had some other side effects, like a little more high blood pressure, no more blood clots in this study, and no real increase in MIs. But they also showed a reduction in 2 cancers, and I have not seen the paper, so this is surprising to me. One was skin cancers, and by that I don't know whether they mean melanomas, which, you know, melanomas can have estrogen receptor. This may be true, I don't know. And colon cancer, and that is surprising because usually estrogen helps lower colon cancer risk, and this lowers estrogen levels. I don't know why that should work. So where does this put us? Well, I would say, I mean, this is not surprising data, but this is established data. And Jack said he thought this meant that for postmenopausal women at increased risk, we should be giving aromatase inhibitors for prevention. Now, Pam Godwin got up and said, well, but there's no direct comparison. Do we need a direct comparison? And I think that practically speaking, most people, when they make decisions about prevention, try to weigh the risks and benefits. One factor that will influence that is the fact that the aromatase inhibitors are not approved by the FDA for prevention. So making sure that you have insurance coverage for these otherwise expensive drugs, even in their generic form, could be an issue. And exemestane is not even going to the FDA looking for prevention as an indication. And I think it's unlikely that anastrozole will go either, although I could be wrong because it's a generic drug now, and they may not ask. But I think the good thing is we actually have now multiple drugs that have been shown to reduce breast cancer risk substantially. So if medication is an acceptable approach for some women to try, then they have choices they can make, and they can line up the benefits and the side effects and make those choices. Not everyone certainly is willing to consider medication as a way to reduce risk, but if that's the way you want to go, then you have at least effective
presentation, an excellent summary. I was so intrigued by the fact that more than 50% of patients had muscle pain at the time that they started on that prevention trial. So these are healthy women, they don't have any breast cancer, right? And the increase in arthralgias was 10% or so. And it kind of goes along with what I'm going to talk about mostly, which is 3 really interesting presentations that talked about problems that patients have with adjuvant hormone therapy. Now, hormone receptor positive breast cancer, as you heard, is a very common form of cancer, the most common form. And hormone therapy is incredibly important. It reduces the risk of recurrence and death from cancer. But we've struggled for really a long time, and more recently with the large hormone therapy trials looking at aromatase inhibitors, with an increasing understanding of the problems with adherence to taking hormone therapy. So we sit in our office and we write out a prescription. We hand you a bottle of pills. We don't hand it anymore, but we send an electronic prescription to your pharmacy. And then you go and you pick up that pharmacy. And you go to the pharmacy and you take the little bottle home, and then somehow you're supposed to remember to take a pill every single day for 5 years or 10 years now. And the big issue is side effects and adherence, because as I say to my patients, if the bottle is on your counter, it's not going to help you at all. So you need to actually take it. So the 3 abstracts were first an abstract from Henry that was associations between baseline patient-reported symptoms and discontinuation of adjuvant AIs, aromatase inhibitors. So when aromatase inhibitors came around and all those big trials led to approval of aromatase inhibitors, the first, I think, emotion that we heard from our patients, and we were thinking too, well, great, people didn't like tamoxifen. They were worried about its side effects, and now they had an alternative that might be a kinder, gentler drug. But of course, we learned over a fairly short period of time that the aromatase inhibitors had a lot of side effects associated with them as well that led to problems with adherence and happiness with the drug, I think, overall. And one of the biggest ones I think we see in practice, they're just estrogen deprivation-related symptoms or joint pains and vaginal dryness. So big question I think that is important to us and to our patients is to understand if something that you have going into your treatment increases your risk of not taking it. So is there something that we could address before you start that would make you more likely to be able to stay on the treatment, less likely to have side effects that would drive you away from this, what we consider incredibly important treatment? So actually they took patients who were on a trial that was looking at letrozole versus exemestane, 2 aromatase inhibitors that we believe to be relatively similar in clinical practice in terms of their effects. They had 449 patients who they were able to follow through the whole time, and 140 patients discontinued their treatment early. That's 31.2%, and that's actually quite similar to what's been reported in other trials. There was a big European and US trial called the TEAM trial that looked at tamoxifen versus exemestane, and about a third of the patients at 2 years had stopped their hormone therapy. So, as we're kind of thinking of longer duration, that's a scary thing to us, and we want to be able to help in whatever way possible to try and make these drugs more tolerable. I thought that the most interesting things from this presentation were, first, the predictors of non-persistence. In other words, who didn't take the hormone therapy. And actually, if you were closer to menopause when you started the hormone therapy, you were less likely to continue. That made a lot of sense to me because we have, and we still define menopause as a point in time when it's actually something that's happening over, a decade or longer as we've aged, us women doing breast cancer. I think we've become much more aware of what menopause really is, that it's an ongoing process that takes a long time. So when your body maybe isn't as used to the estrogen deprivation symptoms, it may be harder to take the aromatase inhibitor, maybe you have more symptoms. Body mass index played a role as well, with patients with larger body mass index having more trouble, interestingly. And then if you've gotten chemotherapy, that also makes a lot of sense because you're still recovering from the chemotherapy, so you feel more symptoms associated with the hormone therapy, whether that's right or wrong. And then the reasons that people stopped were for many different symptoms, but when they looked at the symptoms that patients reported at baseline before they started on their aromatase inhibitor, about a quarter of the patients had 3 to 4 of their list of symptoms at baseline, symptoms that patients report with aromatase inhibitors. And they included poor sleep, fatigue, forgetfulness, and some other interesting side effects, but not joint pain, interestingly. And it turned out that those patients who had the 3 to 4 symptoms at baseline had a 2.5-fold greater chance of stopping their aromatase inhibitor treatment. So what I got out of that is, one, it's really important for our patients to feel that they can communicate what symptoms they have at the time that they're starting hormone therapy. And it's incumbent on us as well to try and work through many of those symptoms as much as possible before or concurrently when patients are going on adjuvant hormone therapy, and to continue to manage them and address those issues over time. Then I think my favorite of these three abstracts was the HOPE study. That's just, it's all in a name. So this I think, a very courageous and great study, which we'd love to see reproduced in a larger randomized study, is randomized women who'd been on aromatase inhibitors for a little while. So they had to have been on for at least 6 months. They had at least mild arthralgias or joint pain, stiffness kind of symptoms, and randomized them to exercise or not. And why exercise? Because there have been scattered reports of actually exercise really helping a sense of well-being, but also joint pains and joint stiffness associated with not only hormone therapy for breast cancer, but also just menopause and aging. And Jennifer Ligbales, who's the senior author of this report, has actually worked very hard on designing a larger trial to look at this question. So in this 121 patient trial, the women had been taking about 1.5 years of aromatase inhibitors. They were about 60 years of age and about 2 years after diagnosis. And they were they started with 1,500 women in order to get to that 121 to randomize on their trial. And the exercise included 2.5 hours a week of aerobic exercise, and then 2 weekly supervised sessions of strength training. Now, that may not be exportable to the general population, but they did a number of different strength-based exercises, but also the aerobic exercise. How many people here do 2.5 hours of aerobic exercise a week? Pretty good. So lots of people. And what about the strength training? Do people routinely do strength training? 2 times a week. That's all you have to do. Not bad. 6 exercises. So actually that's pretty good, because I would say about half the room are doing the strength training, and about 2/3 to 3/4 of the women are doing, and men in the room are doing at least this amount of aerobic exercise, which I think is really great, and I think it definitely goes along with the education we've had with a number of different studies that have been done. But this one looks specifically, I mean, we want it for our health and our weight and our cardiac status and everything else. But this one actually, this study looked at what happened to your joint pains and your arthralgias from the aromatase inhibitors. And people got better. They felt better when they exercised. So the group in the exercise group versus usual care had a small difference in weight, a 3% decrease in weight, but 30% decrease in their worst pain, and a 20 to 30% decrease in their pain severity, or how much the pain interfered with their daily lives. And then the interesting thing they showed over time was that there was some impact at 3 months, but there was even more impact at 12 months. So this is clearly not something, I'll tell my patients, that was actually really good for me, because I'll tell my patients, exercise helps, so you need to do this kind of exercise, go through it. But then they go out and exercise, and 2 weeks later they still have joint pains. But now I think we can really be encouraged that this needs to be incorporated into your daily life. The last of these 3 presentations was by Don Hirschman, who looked at an interesting thing. We now have generic aromatase inhibitors, and we've had generic tamoxifen for a long time. So not a big change in how we get tamoxifen or our co-pays, but a big change in AIs. And the amount that these drugs cost is a huge difference. So the co-pay for a brand name aromatase inhibitor, depending on your plan, could be a substantial amount of money each month, whereas your copay for a generic could be less than $10. So what she wanted to look at was to see whether or not this impacted adherence to hormone therapy, and it did in her study, although there are some caveats to this. The way they defined not taking the hormone therapy was a 45-day gap in treatment, and if you fill it every month. And it's one of these huge insurance-based registries, so there's always some problems with the input of data and output from those kinds of registries. But they pay for the drugs, so they know what people are picking up every month. And it turned out that if you had a lower copay, your adherence was higher, and if you made more money, you had a better adherence as well. And I think that that actually was very interesting. And when patients were on generics versus the patients who were on branded AIs, and it may have been a change, they looked at it over time. And again, this could be influenced by more data about aromatase inhibitors being beneficial or hormone therapy, et cetera. But what they saw was a 38%, more than a third of the patients improved their adherence with the availability of generic drugs. So actually, Don Hirschman has been involved in something called the Cancer Treatment Fairness Act, which others have been as well, which is a bill that's pending. I think that's very important because, if the co-pays are going to make people not take therapy, which is potentially life-saving, then that's something we really need to work on as we work on health insurance and health care for all in the United States. A very important goal. Thank you.
Well, again, thanks to the Alamo Cancer Foundation again for bringing you all here and for inviting me and all of us to participate. One of the great things I know that's a gift that we give to you at these sessions is a gift of not having a lot of slides and figures. Not that those aren't good, but probably you've seen plenty of them during the day today. The other gift that we can give to you that I know all of us enjoy is the opportunity to tell stories, because it's often in the telling of stories and in the providing of context that we really learn and understand something, and then can go out and incorporate that into our own lives and bring that to life for other people. So one of the things I've done in previous years is, the advances that we hear about this year, I think all of us have recognized now, boy, they're often very much dependent on smart people in the past, on pioneers in the past, on people who were courageous in the past, in the lab and in their research. And actually, in the past years, I've looked at the year's prizes, the Nobel Prizes in chemistry and medicine, and tried to weave that into the story about what did we see here, at San Antonio, and why was the work that was done years ago, because usually the Nobel Prize recognizes contributions from the past. And in thinking about that for this year, I did look at prizes in chemistry. I looked at prizes in physics and in medicine. But I ended up being moved to do something different, and I was moved, by the passing of Nelson Mandela. And it was actually 20 years ago that he got a prize. He got the Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions in South Africa. And in thinking about his story, and I actually had an opportunity to go to South Africa for a wedding of some friends of the family a year ago, and it was an amazing place to go. I was able to get a tour of Johannesburg. The tour took us past the house where he was living, took us to his house in Soweto, which was right down the block from Desmond Tutu, where he grew up. And again, I think in thinking about how does this relate to cancer, I think to beat your enemy, you have to know your enemy. And he inspired us in many ways. He was persecuted and imprisoned for 27 years. And in a way, that was his cancer. That was, an affliction that was forced on him that he didn't deserve, that he had to live with. But in the way that he responded to it, others have said that he was freer in prison than the men that kept him there. Even they came to admire him. The ability with which he used his brutal imprisonment, his cancer, to transform himself with grace and dignity, made it possible for him subsequently to achieve reconciliation for his entire company, to come to terms with it. And when bad things happen, we often have to find ways to come to terms with what's going on. So I think in thinking about the work that he did in the past and what he leaves us and why it matters to us here who are fighting cancer, it's that leadership really matters. And we have the talent, we have amazing talent and the resources and skills in this room and at this meeting to really make a difference. That ingredient of leadership, those skills that we need to develop, are going to be so critical to achieve success faster. Thank you. The other thing that I wanted to do was to follow up a bit on the previous talks and talk. We just heard a bit about adherence, the importance of, in a way, it's all about, and we heard about the androgen receptor and maybe precision medicine that might be able to target the right patients with the right drug, the concept of personalized or precision medicine. Related to that is a concept of over-treatment and under-treatment. The right thing is the right amount of treatment, but obviously sometimes for various reasons we discover in our system that we shift in the wrong direction. Actually, Hope just told us about a study with regard to exercise that's probably a case of under-treatment, that there's a modality of what we can do in terms of getting greater wellness in our lives that many of us choose not to take advantage of. The other thing, though, is that there's often over-treatment or overuse of tests. I'm a big fan of tests, but there was a poster this morning that highlighted and made the point that in terms of that concept of getting it right, you know, a good test is just as important as a good drug, but a bad test or a test that's used when it shouldn't be used can be just as bad as a bad drug. And so at MD Anderson, Dr. Barsanis and colleagues presented a poster. They had reviewed a database that that looked at the question of the use of PET scans, CT scans, and bone scans at the time of workup for a diagnosis of early breast cancer. And currently all the guidelines recommend that those tests should not be used. They found a database that reviewed it was, I think, something like almost 46,000 women who were diagnosed with breast cancer, you know, between, I think it was 2005 and 2010. And they looked at the rate of use of those tests, CT scans, PET scans, and bone scans. They actually found that over that time period, they were used in 37% of cases. So clearly, you know, the first step in trying to get things right is to present and publicize, this is what we're doing, is this the right thing, let's make sure we talk about it. So I think that was good that, you know, that they had, you know, prepared that summary and communicated that, and certainly that's something we need to go back and talk about. That's not something, again, that's going to lead to better outcomes in the long run. And certainly if we look at the costs of doing all that testing, we could use that money and spend it much more wisely. In terms of, again, over-treatment and under-treatment, and again, this is, you know, certainly not only a topic at this meeting. Dr. Schroeder and colleagues at the University of Iowa reviewed the SEER database of 65,000 women and looked at the question of to what degree in 2010 is breast cancer being treated by mastectomy compared to lumpectomy. And from a historical perspective, Bernie Fisher got the Lasker Award in 1985. He had been the leader of a study that looked at the question of, again, getting it right. Indeed, there are some women in whom mastectomy is absolutely the right thing to do, you know, based on evidence and a variety of criteria. But he did a study that looked at could outcomes be obtained with lumpectomy, which are just as good as those with mastectomy for a large proportion of women. He got the award in 1985, and at that time, they recognized that the rate of mastectomy in 1972 was 47%, and it went down to 4.5% in 1985. So the data was reviewed then today and presented by Dr. Schroeder. In 2010, the rate was back up to 43.5%, which is, you know, really, you know, quite striking. So, and again, that's an important topic. For some in many cases, that's the right thing to do. But clearly, that's a case where we've had a shift. They tried to look at some of the psychosocial and other issues that are driving that. That might come up in the discussion, but I wanted to highlight that. And lastly, on the side of genomics, we're very much where we were in 1980, at the end of the last century, when the first human genome was sequenced. That genome was published, and everyone said, "Oh my gosh, we're going to understand everything in the next year or two." And guess what? You know, we had to, as scientists and clinicians, be very careful to set people's expectations. That it was after you had the first genome, and there were all these new genes, 23,000 or so. We realized it was going to take a while to figure it out and how to create practical advances out of that. Actually, the Oncotype DX test benefited from that first genome, and we couldn't have done what we did in the first decade of this century without that work at the end of the last century. So now we're seeing at this meeting there are these new machines that are capable of not just doing one genome, and taking years to do that, but now doing whole genomes over the course of a week or two or three. And doing it for much less money. It's still not inexpensive, but still much less money than that first genome. So we're going to begin to see examples of how we're going to gain insights and how we're going to be able to make advances. But I do want to caution us that in terms of clinical research, it's really critical for our research that we use this new tool. But in terms of practice change, and do we know enough to really now say that, boy, oh boy, this is now going to make a difference in what I do tomorrow. Let's make sure that we, like every advance, think about that carefully. There was, though, an observation reported today about estrogen receptor, which was really pretty cool. And I think it's something that's going to be increasingly important for our field. We really, are thinking a lot about advanced disease. It's not all about, coming up with better treatments for early breast cancer. And clearly we're going to do better by studying sensitivity and resistance and how to combine therapies in a more rational way. I mean, that's how the advance, I always use infectious disease often as an example of where we need to be and how we manage and treat cancer. And HIV, again, was managed and treated by figuring out how to combine and use multiple drugs based on tests to be able to get better outcomes and ultimately, really long-term survival. I mean, look at Magic Johnson. So Dr. Jellison and colleagues reported on alterations in the estrogen receptor. Again, that was highlighted earlier. That's the protein that's targeted by aromatase inhibitors and tamoxifen. They identified that in the setting of treatment, it is possible that mutations develop in that receptor, and we might now be able to have tests that can identify when and what kind of mutations might occur, and then figure out what new kinds of therapies might we use to overcome or avoid that resistance. Let's just, again, not clear yet, even although the mutations were found, not clear yet that they're associated yet with resistance. I'm sure we're going to hear about that from laboratory experiments next year, but that's going to be, I think, increasingly important story of what we're going to be able to do, this idea of being able to personalize or better identify sensitivity, resistance, and how to combine and get to the right drug sooner. Thanks.
This is always a pleasure to be here. This is the highlight of my San Antonio meeting every single year, so I appreciate the invitation, and I really appreciate you being here today. I will focus on the first and the last talk of the day. The first talk was kind of a review from Michael Gnant on bisphosphonates and treatment, and, as well as prevention of breast cancer. And the last one was a meta-analysis that was done on multiple studies, some of which were presented last year at this exact meeting, on the role of bisphosphonates in women that have breast cancer. So the interesting thing with bisphosphonates is a few years ago we heard from Peter Rabden how the incidence of breast cancer started decreasing around 2002, 2003. And the thought was that the reason for that may be that 6 months earlier, women were discontinuing hormone replacement therapy because of the Women's Health Initiative data, showing that hormone replacement therapy might increase the risk of breast cancer. So a lot of women discontinued them. 6 months later, the incidence of breast cancer started dropping. Interestingly, around the exact same time, our use of bisphosphonates increased. So when you look at those curves, it's really unclear, is it really the hormone replacement therapy that is decreasing the incidence of breast cancer, or is it the fact that we're using more bisphosphonates preventing breast cancers? Obviously, that's an unanswered question. But speaking about women that have been diagnosed with breast cancer and trying to see how we can prevent recurrences, there were a few studies looking at bisphosphonates for prevention purposes. Honestly, a lot of those studies started because of the role of aromatase inhibitors in bone loss and how we can prevent bone loss by giving bisphosphonates to women while they are on aromatase inhibitors. And those studies showed that by giving those bisphosphonates, you may actually not just prevent bone loss, but you may also prevent recurrences. So as the Oxford people usually do, they perform this large meta-analysis of 22,000 women. And imagine we needed 22,000 women to participate in studies to answer a question. But thankfully, we did have 22,000 brave women that were out there in 36 trials. From those trials, what the results were that in women that are in some way postmenopausal, either because they're over 55 or because we've given them medications to make them postmenopausal, giving them a bisphosphonate decreases the risk of recurrence and decreases the risk of death. And when you look at those recurrences and those deaths, that improvement in the benefit is very similar to the improvement in benefit that we see from hormone therapies and from chemotherapies. So you add all that together, and you're helping women live significantly longer. Now, the interesting thing about those recurrences is that they decrease the risk of bone recurrences, not really other distant recurrences. So if a woman was going to have metastatic disease to her liver or her lung, that was not really prevented by bisphosphonates, but if she was going to have metastatic disease to her bones, that's what was prevented. But regardless of that, women were still living longer with the use of those bisphosphonates. And that improvement was, in overall survival, was 17%, so a pretty good number. All that was irrespective of whether a woman had an ER positive or an ER negative breast cancer. So that didn't matter. So that treatment will work in a postmenopausal woman regardless of what kind of breast cancer she has, which I think is probably the most interesting finding. We don't have to only use it in ER positive or only use it in ER negative women. So obviously the question is, what do we do Monday when we all go to clinic and we start seeing patients, right? We've had this data for a while, so this is not really new, but this is more the definitive data that we have all kind of thought was coming from last year's presentations, where we saw this benefit in multiple studies in either a postmenopausal subgroup or in a postmenopausal study. So this all makes sense. And I think we should all be thinking about adding these medications to our patients. Obviously, one of the issues is going to be coverage. These medications are not approved for prevention. They're approved for osteoporosis or osteopenia. The other thing is that all those studies did not include those oral bisphosphonates that a lot of women are on for osteoporosis. They included intravenous bisphosphonates either every month or every 6 months. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind, that if we want to stick to the data, and the data that was presented either last year or today, we want to be giving those women the bisphosphonates that were studied for breast cancer recurrence prevention. So those are kind of my thoughts. And again, I really appreciate everybody being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our mentors for sharing what they thought were the highlights of today at the SABCS. Thank you so much. We're now going to start the questions and answers, and I'm going to start with the first one, and it's for Dr. Hudis. You mentioned when you came in that you had something that you wanted to talk about the government, and since these are all advocates, and the majority of them are, we would really like to hear what you have to say.
So you just like to get me hot under the collar.
Don't hold back.
Yeah, so for those of you who are fans of politics, you'll know that, and I'll be sort of high level about this, we've been operating without a fixed and formal budget for the last, I think, 2 years with continuing resolutions. And the sort of Damocles that was created to force a budget resolution, of course, was the sequestration, which was never, ever supposed to happen, but did. The sequestration was really bad for science, for health science, among others, because not only did it lock a fixed percent, I think about 6% off of the planned spending at important institutions like the NIH and the NCI, it did not do it at the beginning of the fiscal year. It actually did it during the year, which meant that the entire shortfall had to be made up in less than the fiscal year. So the immediate impact of each sequestration step would be that you would have to scale back spending in a laboratory or in projects by 10, 12%, 15% to make up for the fact that you're partway through the fiscal year before you know that. And in science, which relies not on the profit motive in government, but on steady funding to make plans and investments, this is just devastating because labs can't hire, expand, pursue new leads, and they have to become very conservative as a consequence. The first point to make is that as a consequence of the sequestration, what we've lost is unknowable, but can't be good. Now what I mean is you don't know which projects weren't launched, which studies weren't taken forward, how much longer it takes till we make an important advance that it gets translated into the kind of work that you've heard about. Steve provided, for example, a concrete translation of pure government investment that led to a really important commercial project. Indeed, scientific investment by the United States government is not a loss leader. It's a phenomenal engine of growth. $4 of local spending generally accrue anywhere that federal money is spent on science. Every dollar, that is, leads to 4. And our, forgive the term, but American exceptionalism to some degree can be traced to the technological and scientific investment that we've made steadily since the end of World War II. So, the good news against all that, now that we've been through 2 sequestration cuts and a debt ceiling leading to the government shutdown in October, which, mind you, cost exactly the same as 5 years of funding of the NCI total all in. So $5 billion per year for the NCI is a line item within the roughly $32 billion NIH budget, and the government shutdown cost 5 times that. I mention that, by the way, to point out to you, whenever somebody explains to you that we can't afford these things that we want, your answer is, of course we can. We spend 5 times that without even a discussion. So at any rate, the good news, after all that bleakness, is that there's bipartisan agreement as of late last night on a budget through 2015, which does 2 things. It eliminates most of the domestic program cuts. It does not protect Medicare, however. That still faces a 2% cut, which we'll be hearing about, I'm sure. But it does protect the spending, domestic spending on science and NIH and elsewhere. So, you know, we'll have a reprieve where the never-ending cuts will be evaded. By the way, that's not the same as growth, and that's a different story. There will be a little bit of growth probably, but not a lot. It passed the House late today. It needs to pass the Senate next, and the President has said that he'll sign it when that happens. So out of all this darkness, a little sliver of light, which is that we may move past this period that we've gotten used to of terrible budgetary uncertainty, and that will be very good for science, because we need to know that money's coming in to make investments. Not that I care about this very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, start over here.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Barbara Fleming. I want to thank, first of all, the Alamo folks, because this is a great program, and then our mentors. I hope I get 2 questions in, because Dr. Hudis' comments made me want to ask what the action step is for us. But actually, I have another burning question. So maybe he will, without me having to ask 2 questions, get to that later. What's the action step for us? But the question I had is about the bisphosphonate study. I thought that was one of the 2 really exciting. There are many exciting, 30% I didn't understand at all, but anyway, they were very exciting today. On the bisphosphonate study, my question is in terms of the clinical implications. I wasn't sure what all the patient populations were for the study. So when you guys on Monday see someone, is it newly diagnosed with breast cancer, who's had breast cancer and been, what's the patient population that you see using bisphosphonates for?
So in those studies, what was studied was a newly diagnosed breast cancer patient that had finished chemotherapy if they were going to have chemotherapy and were going to either go on endocrine therapy or not. Having said that, we still need data to generalize that. So if you have somebody who's 3 years out and is doing well, do you want to start a bisphosphonate on them? We really don't have the data to do that. But somebody who's finishing their chemotherapy, there is pretty strong data, not just from this meta-analysis, but the individual studies that led to that meta-analysis suggesting that we should.
Okay, thank you. Action step.
So the action step with regard to the budget is, honestly, I made this comment at the last Alliance meeting. We actually have to become more engaged. We have to actually call our congressmen and women, and we have to call our senators. We have to go to their offices. We have to get to know them. Because the truth is they need input and guidance. And surprisingly, maybe it's surprising, a lot of them are pretty responsive once they know they're humans behind the law.
And they definitely do not think that people care about cancer anymore.
Right.
They will tell you that, what about the days of the marches when people were out there in the streets? Now they don't hear about cancer. They don't think we care, and so they don't think that this is where the money needs to go. So it is, they respond to all kinds of things, but emails, texts, Twitters to their offices, they need to know that we do care.
For ASCO and AACR members, what I tell them is when you get emails from ASCO AACR that ask you to contact your congressman, take 5 minutes and just send the email. I've been amazed. I don't think it's just because I have a president of ASCO under my name. I actually get responses from every single senator and
But they count all that stuff.
Yep.
They count all of it, and they need to know that we're still out there.
Okay, you just got your action alert from your researchers. You have to go to work. Okay.
Hi, I'm Roberta Gelb from New York, from SHARE and Breast Cancer Action, and the New York State Breast Cancer Network, on which we have all of our elected officials on speed dial. So if you live in New York State and you don't know about the New York State Breast Cancer Network, come see me, because we're very active and we know all of our representatives. I also have a question on the bisphosphonates. First of all, I just want to say this is such an incredible panel that limiting us to one question is really unfair. Can we get back online again if we ask a question?
We're doing good on time, so let's see, we maybe have to do 2.
Okay. So I have a broader question about the bisphosphonates, because what I found fascinating in that presentation was the broader picture for bisphosphonates. Since we all, I have 2 basic questions on metastatic disease. Where do the cells go, and what activates them? I know that's very basic, but I'm hearing a lot about the bone marrow niche, and that's a place where they can be hiding out very successfully. So how does this bisphosphonate study relate to the overall examination of the bone's role in not only breast cancer, but perhaps many more cancers?
Well, that's exactly what I think it is. There are some cells that are going to be in the bone marrow or the bone, and those cells, because of that microenvironment that the bisphosphonates are going to form, are going to die. And that's why you see in that meta-analysis that you're preventing bone metastases, but you're not really preventing liver metastases or lung metastases because that microenvironment is not strong enough to go throughout the whole body. I'll take a risk, but everybody should chime in. I mean, this is a long story. Bisphosphonates have been studied. I think the Deal studies were probably 20 years ago. And as is, I think, often true about these drugs, we understand some of what they do. I'm not sure we understand all of what they do. They certainly raise the question of whether the bone marrow was a place where cells could hide, because we all know that for women with estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, sometimes disease can come back after 20 years and you wonder, where's it been? What's it been doing? These data are very interesting. They're still, I would say they raise as many questions as they answer, because why does this only work in women who are postmenopausal at the time that they get their drug? Why does it not seem to work at all in women who have become menopausal? There was discussion about this by the man who presented who presented the meta-analysis. He said he would only give the drug to people at diagnosis, not if you've been on an aromatase inhibitor for a while or on a medication for a while, because it seemed that the main effect was early. But the effect on recurrence is at like 10 years. So why would that be true? I'm not saying that this is not an advance, but it is a confusing advance. I think, as is often true, it raises a lot of questions, and figuring out the specifics of this, to me, is still a challenge. And I don't understand why last year, in the list of trials, some were positive, some were negative. The meta-analysis helps to deal with some of that, but it doesn't answer all the questions. Maybe you want to add to that.
I agree, although I do think that the majority of patients who've been reported in trials where there was a benefit didn't get chemotherapy, which is an interesting thing. Whether or not you, I don't think we'll ever sort any of this out, whether or not you, by giving chemotherapy and causing recycling of bone marrow progenitors, you change the environment in a way that bisphosphonates don't affect. It's not clear. I think the one group of patients where there was, I think the cleanest data set were premenopausal women whose ovaries were suppressed and were given hormone therapy. And in that situation where there's very acute bone loss in the first 6 months, 6 to 12 months, there seemed to be an impact on survival. So, you take a bunch of studies of which many of which are positive and one big one was negative, and you do a meta-analysis, then what ends up happening is you get a positive result. So it is hard to know how to put that into practice. And it'd be interesting just across the panel to see what you do in these situations. I generally use bisphosphonates, and I don't know that that will change any in patients who have bone loss. And whether we should be giving them earlier in premenopausal women whose ovaries we suppress is a question.
Or postmenopausal women who haven't otherwise been on them, or who have been on Fosamax and not on
and aren't getting chemo.
And remember that this becomes a real insurance challenge, because Reclass, which is exactly the same drug, but is approved for osteoporosis, costs a certain amount of money, is only approved for that. Zoledronate or Zometa is approved in the metastatic setting. Nothing is approved in this particular setting, and how we're going to get this paid for, very expensive drug, will be a real challenge. So we can't just go to the office Monday morning and say, great, we're going to start everybody on drug.
I'm not sure that's my conclusion from it, but
well, what is your conclusion?
I don't think it's much different than when going into it. I'm not sure it changed my...
I find it extremely challenging, because this is an area where the findings are intriguing, but scientifically a little bit odd. A change in bone recurrence, not a change in other sites of disease, and the change in survival now, which is sort of surprising in some ways. And the other issue, of course, has been the mixed results historically. Frankly, if I were the pharmaceutical company and I saw these kinds of positive results, if they were good enough to convince me to change practice, I would hope they'd be good enough to convince the FDA to change the label. And if they did that, the reimbursement would be fixed, obviously. I think it also may help that the NCCN and others will look at this and maybe make some clinical sense that will help all of us. I'm a little bit cautious about endorsing blanket treatment of everybody when we don't really understand what we're seeing here.
So who do you give bisphosphonates to who are not osteoporotic or have metastatic disease?
Right, well, historically, I've given them to nobody who did not have a standard indication for the drug.
How about next week?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge. So I think I don't know the answer yet. What I'm going to do is meet with the 24 members of my faculty, and we're going to make a standard for the group. And I don't know what it will be yet. I'm not going into this a priori with a decision.
You can look at the paper too, because
Yeah.
there are a lot of details that you can't get in a
Right.
15-minute presentation.
Is it public?
He didn't say,
No,
he didn't say that.
I don't believe it has been yet. So, that's always a caution about these kinds of findings. This is not primary data, it's meta-analysis, it's not peer published yet, it's maybe peer reviewed, but we haven't seen the final manuscript that you can sit and go over. And honestly, data's been known to change from a slide talk to a paper.
So we're not sure what to tell you, there you go. The take-home message is wait and see.
And we didn't mention the side effects that are potentially associated with bisphosphonates. They mentioned that, the incidence of osteonecrosis of the jaw was lower than expected, less than 1%. But I can guarantee you that a good dentist can always tell a patient who's on a bisphosphonate versus a patient who's not on a bisphosphonate. And that tells me that even though that woman does not have ONJ, that jaw does not look normal. So that again is an issue. I think it's underreported.
But you know that that's true, because what I've found, and I think we've all now been giving bisphosphonates for many years to our patients with advanced disease, and what I feel like the incidence of osteonecrosis is massively higher than has been reported in these patients who stay on it month after month after month for years. So now we stop more. Because I think, we see ONJ in almost everybody who lives a long time on
It's not just that, not to worry about their bones.
and their bone fractures, et cetera. But ONJ is a big issue because they get, pain in their bones and have to, big deal, antibiotics, et cetera. But, and most of those patients have also gotten chemo and they've had metastatic disease for a number of years, gotten lots of exposure. But in the early stage setting, you give it every 6 months for 7 doses. It's hard to know that you could tell anything was going on. I don't think we've really seen much data that dosing schedule results in much toxicity at all.
It's interesting, for all of this enthusiasm for the people who actually need bisphosphonates because of bone metastases, I get a lot of pushback for fear of ONJ. And so I think it's just one of those interesting moments where on the one hand, we're talking about adding it to a group of people with a small but maybe real benefit. And then among people where there's a proven benefit, there is a tremendous caution in the community about allowing themselves to receive it because of the rare rate of ONJ.
Do all of y'all know what ONJ is?
Osteonecrosis of the jaw, I'm sorry, that's what we're talking about, that the dentist can see changes.
I want to make sure.
I've only had 2 patients develop frank osteonecrosis of the jaw over all these years, but it's an outsized concern. I don't know what your experience is. That people don't want to take it because they're afraid of it.
I think people don't want to take it in the early stage setting because they are afraid of it a lot. It's interesting because denosumab, the rank ligand inhibitor, which is another drug that prevents bone loss and is given by an injection under the skin, also causes about the same amount of ONJ, but we haven't given it long enough in the metastatic setting to see the same kinds of side effects. But it's reported to have the same small amount of ONJ during the studies that compared these drugs. And I think patients have been afraid of them. Once they have metastatic disease, when patients have advanced cancer, generally they'll take the bisphosphonate with the idea that it might delay progression, help pain. But as I say, I generally stop it after when the disease is more quiet or after people have been on the drugs for a long time. Early stage disease is a whole separate issue. And I think there is a fair amount of concern about these longer term toxicities. But when you talk about the Gannett data, the data from the Austrian group, he spoke the first thing this morning. He didn't really talk a lot about his data, but more of an overview. He had no cases, essentially, with his 7 doses of bisphosphonates. So patients got the seleginate every 6 months for 7 doses. And they really didn't see any complications. So when I talk to patients about that, they're less worried.
Well, this is really interesting. I love when the doctors get in a dialogue with each other. I think this is really unique to our program. I mean, you don't see this. You don't get to see this. where they're actually having a dialogue with each other. Okay, I promise you, waiting in line here, we had some extra time, so I think we're going to get to all the questions. So go ahead.
Almost every other presentation talks about the number of mutations, the most common mutations. And the most common mutations in cancer, P53 and PI3 kinase. Okay? And then they proceed to talk about PI3 kinase. And they've studied P53 forever and ever and ever, as far as I can determine. What is it so complicated? What a 3-second description, because everything rests on, so much rests on P53, and I looked at the program and I do not see anything discussing it. And so 5 minutes or 3 seconds on P53.
I'll start out by just acknowledging you're real smart, and you just made a really important point. An incredible number of people have devoted their careers and their whole labs with a tremendous amount of funding to try to untangle and understand. It's not so much. I think we have insights into the role of P53, but I think what we've all hoped would be that an understanding of it would lead to practical advances or approaches that could lead either to prevention or treatment. And I'm not an expert in that area, and actually one of the things when there's often a big literature in a field, it's actually then even harder for many of us to approach it even, and so it's like this giant hairball. But I think what I've heard also is that even in those cases where there isn't a P53 mutation, there might be other molecular alterations that provide the same kind of biological impact that P53 does. So I don't know, maybe others on the panel, have you worked in that area at all?
Well, I studied inherited disorders, so inherited mutations of P53, but in my simple way of thinking about this, PI3 kinase is an incredibly important molecule, and one of the things that makes it so attractive is that there are drugs that are targeting PI3 kinase. P53 is a mutation set that's almost impossible to target at this time. So there are, and it was the molecule of the year, right? It's 80% of cancers have P53 mutations, but it's not the kind of mutation that's targetable right now. So I think that's why you see at a meeting like this, lots of interest in PI3 kinase inhibitors and nothing about radio silence on P53. So we can hope that will change, but it's a huge subject of research. It's just going to take a very different strategy from anything currently available that I know about, but you know more.
Yeah, and the other thing, just to kind of keep in mind that there are different cancers that will have mutations in P53 versus PI3 kinase. So the basal cell cancers, which are usually the triple negative breast cancers, will be P53 positive for some mutations, not all of them by any means. And then some of the ER positive breast cancers will have mutations for PI3 kinase. So that's kind of like the general picture.
The other thing I think is we need to be committed to do in our research is to recognize, and we learn this from in inherited diseases and genetic diseases, is that, and let's take PI3 kinase as an example, it's probably the case that although there's PI3 kinase mutations in many different individual breast cancers, they're different mutations. And we need to be open to the fact that not all of those individual mutations are going to be the same, and we may need to learn about different groups and subsets even of the PI3 kinase family of alterations. And that's what we got to be committed to do, is to be open to those kinds of insights that we need to get as we go forward.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Karuna Jagger, I'm Executive Director of Breast Cancer Action, and I want to thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the caution that you demonstrated in talking about the bisphosphonate data, and I also appreciated the focus on policy. And so I want to take a different turn on the policy. So, you know, the point that we need funding, independent funding for research is a good point, and the piece that I want to turn to is, so here we have this conference where all these well-intentioned, super smart people are working to develop more effective, less toxic treatments, and we need to get those into the hands of women. And that brings me to Don Hirschman's paper about the barriers to women. And so I want to talk about a different policy piece, which is what can we do to rein in the costs of these treatments, and why can we not set limits on health care profits? These are not iPads, right? This is not like unlimited profits for some trivial, you know, enjoyment. These are life-saving technologies that need to get in the hands of women, and I think we need to explore limits on profiting.
So I will take the risk of trying to answer this. This is a very, very difficult problem, and there is no simple answer. But let me start by maybe explaining a little bit what the real problem is. Price setting in medicine. So what I mean is, of course, if you walk out of here tonight and you decide you need a new four-door sedan, you go to the Chevy dealer or the Ford dealer or the Hyundai dealer and you compare options and you take a couple of days or weeks and you play one off the other and you derive an honest price. I want to point something out to you. The price that Cadillac charges for a new car is not really determined by the cost of production. It's determined by what the buyers will pay, period. And if they can't produce the car at lower price than what the buyers will pay, they don't produce it or they slowly go out of business or whatever happens. That's the world. That's the old Adam Smith simple economic model that we want. The problem in healthcare, of course, is that the consumer actually isn't the patient. The consumer is at perhaps the physician ordering drugs and treatments, but that consumer doesn't have any obvious or maybe doesn't have the purest of economic motives. And I don't mean that they're impure or evil or malevolent. I just mean that they don't bear a moral hazard for any of the choices they make normally. And so what I'm slowly describing, of course, is a completely broken system. Okay, so out of the 10 drugs that Medicare spends money on, the top 8 drug money consumers are cancer drugs, and of the 8, a few of them across all cancers, a few of them are really pretty remarkable drugs that have transformed illnesses. Others, honestly, are a little different than what came before. There is absolutely a reason that virtually all of the drugs approved in the last 2 years come in the neighborhood of $100,000 a year for use. That can't be what the market will bear, or at least not what a normal market would bear. That is what this market is bearing. And so I'm giving you this long answer, which I know doesn't help much, because if you want to fix this, and I do too, we're going to have to do one of two things. And that is either start from scratch with an entirely new healthcare system, and that is simply not going to happen, or we're going to have to engage in meaningful, constructive dialogue with all players. And I mean regulators, insurers, patients, physician groups, many of them. I believe me, yeah, within the physician world, there are widely divergent opinions. I get hate mail, personal mail, for things that I say with regard to the ACA and so forth. Electronic email. I really do, and I'm not making light of it. And nobody's threatened me yet, but the comments clearly represent the people just rather trying to find the right word. People really are upset with me over this because their livelihoods are in some cases on the line. And so I think that... You really think their livelihoods are on the line? Yes, they are. I'll explain what I mean in a second. But the point is that compromise is going to be needed. So I will just end this by saying the position that I'm taking personally, I'm speaking for myself, but trying to engage, especially pharma, is those of us in organized medicine
and politicians and others who are actually going to help, because the current system is going to break their system of rewards also. And that'll be worse. So we need a soft landing from this current situation instead of a hard one, I think. And it's going to take compromise, and not everybody will have the hope. To your question, yes, their livelihoods are on the line because they won't become paupers. But I think some people are going to see meaningful falls in income, and I think some shareholders are going to see meaningful falls in share value. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways this plays out. In the end, we're spending exactly twice as much as other Western countries for about the same outcomes.
Yeah.
And when we suck that money out of the system, it's coming out somewhere.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's one thing.
Just one thing I could just mention as something I was working with, because I was trying to find somebody to fill out paperwork for free drug here, since everybody's here. We have patients who can't get medication still in the United States. I just was so incredibly amazed that one of my patients who has so-called Medi-Cal Medicaid, but has some income coming in from disability to support her 2 kids, and has liver failure and metastatic breast cancer and is generally a mess. And I don't want to give her any IV chemos now because her counts are low. There's an oral chemotherapy drug called capecitabine, Xeloda. Well, it's becoming generic in February, but until then, it would be $2,500 out of pocket per month. Well, that's about her entire income in San Francisco.
Where there's a $10,000 deductible.
Right.
It's a joke.
Anyway, you can get 1 month of free drug. That's
Well, with all that, it seems to me we shouldn't turn our back on the revolution that Dr. Hudis proposed as option 1.
Well,
You say you want a revolution. Okay.
The other perspective on this, I have had now the opportunity, as we've taken the work that we've done and worked out and provide access for testing to women wherever they live all around the world, is to see how many other different healthcare systems there are out there. And it turns out, although it turns out that in fact nobody else has figured out a creative and a great solution to this yet. But in traveling around, at least hearing and thinking about what are the themes that at least make sense, at the forefront of them, I think, is to think that we do care about healthcare. When we and our loved ones have issues, I think about where I'd like to spend my money, and we'll put money there and invest in things. But I think the 2 things that would be important to me personally would be, 1, knowing what works. I mean, we want to, you spend money on things that have proven value, where we understand the benefits and the risks, and that we own as much a responsibility as consumers as the whole system does, in making sure that information is transparent and available. The information is powerful. I think there are forces with the internet that are helping, and these kinds of sessions that help us become more informed. The second is this concept, the words that I speak about when I go to Washington and argue for what at least should be at the core of this, is value-based pricing. That again, there's some therapies, right, Cliff, that provide 2 weeks of freedom from disease progression. Well, we can actually, and we should be talking about what does that actually mean, how much value is there, and it should, the price of the drug should be consistent with that amount of value. On the other hand, there are other things that are much more cost effective, and it would seem that those things then should be able to be, should derive more value and generate more charge. That would give us the incentive to invest in things that are going to make a big difference. And I think that's what we really want to see for the future.
One thing to point out is that for the focus on drugs, which is appropriate, about 12% of the healthcare cost.
Well, and also the other part of this, which I think is a part of the whole picture, is that we all have colleagues in countries around the world, and we hear about what's available to those patients. And there are very few other places in the world where patients have as much access to drugs as ours do. It's interesting.
Then we're going to get into the first world debate. Sorry, not to interrupt, but then we're going to go down that rabbit hole of, sure, first world, third world, yes, radical disparities
that's an
of
excuse.
access. But I'm saying within the first world, we're spending all this money on drugs and we're not actually achieving better health. And my real concern is, I'm sorry. Please.
But in other first world countries, our neighbors, they really don't want to be called not first world over in Europe, they do, everybody has health care. I mean, nobody's going to buy their Zolota, or their Capecitabine, but they also don't get to decide what they take when. And so we do. And I think that is among the wealthier countries in the world. That has been the biggest difference in terms of drugs. Now, as Cliff pointed out, the drugs represent a small part of this. So I don't know how much that impacts our costs and what the issues are, but it is true. We want to give fulvestrant first line. We give fulvestrant first line, but my colleagues in the UK can't.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I actually, I think this issue of the cost of our healthcare system is a really big and important one, and I was really turning us primarily to access for patients and to the disparities for patients, and the fact that here we are at this conference talking about improvements that women can't get their hands on because of our broken healthcare system, and I really feel like that's
now we're getting into time, so we're going to have to go to the next question.
That's good.
Okay.
Hi, Ida Sampaio from SHARE, National Breast Cancer Coalition and the Alliance. And I want to thank all the presenters today. You really make sure that everything is nice and clear, and I love hearing the conversations too. But I had a question actually a comment more with respect to the aromatase inhibitors and the lack of adherence. One of the things we have a lot of support groups at SHARE in New York City, and we had to actually start one for aromatase inhibitors because of all of the adverse effects that they were receiving. So one of the things that I was thinking of, we do have a broken system. You receive the aromatase inhibitors, they're saying well, exercise might be good for you or something else might be good for you. And I'm thinking along the ways where if you're diagnosed with breast cancer and you're given an aromatase inhibitor, I think we need to think a little bit further down the road with respect to having a model where we can turn around and provide additional services within the actual healthcare system. When a patient receives and is no longer a handed prescription, whether it's electronic or not, that prescription for the aromatase inhibitor, make sure that there's ways that she can receive either yoga classes, exercise, to get psychosocial support for what she's dealing with, to be able to use complementary therapies, things that would assist this patient so that she can continue using the aromatase inhibitors rather than to say, oh, you're just complaining about this, or okay, we'll deal with this when this happens. Putting something in place, I think, ahead of time and putting it in a model form that then can actually be used nationally, I think would make a lot more sense rather than to do it as a broken system like we have today, that it's in bits and pieces.
So you're describing a model that's actually used for diabetes and blood pressure control in some small demonstration projects through the Accountable Care Organization structure. And what they've done in many cases is hired people who call patients with diabetes daily, review what they're eating, and then talk about their treatment. And they've shown really concretely in those settings that they can lower hospitalization rates and improve glycemic control, hypertension, the same thing. I think you make a really good point, but we would have to get organized and provide an infrastructure and programs for such a work. Even though it might not all be evidence-based, the truth is it's much less expensive than most of the alternatives.
We should be able, I think, to prescribe exercise to patients. I think, we do that, but of course it's not a reimbursed healthcare cost.
Right.
But I think that if there are programs available for breast cancer patients or just cancer patients, then that's really helpful. And certainly in San Francisco, we've worked with our local Jewish Community Center on trying to have resources available, not necessarily for a health club membership, but one of the clubs has provided short-term memberships for patients who are diagnosed with breast cancer, and with the work of a private practitioner in the city, but also to provide just training on exercise. and how to exercise, because you don't need machines, you know.
Right.
And I think one of the things that a lot of these studies find is that supervision is a big part of it. And so having a group, I love the idea of having a support group for patients on hormone therapy, because you could actually incorporate an exercise program, and people just do better in groups, and when, you know, somebody knows when you don't show up, you know.
True, but one of the issues there is that there are people that don't have the income to be able to pay for a membership in a gym. So maybe if it's part of a program, in a way that then people are
Yes,
given that
and you're getting
information,
educated.
so that then she's better prepared. You know, the idea is, you know, so I always tell the doctors that we work with that it's almost like a commercial, an educated consumer is your best bet. And absolutely, that is the case. When people learn what might be happening, what might be some of the side effects, what are your options, what you can do, and receive the full support, they wind up doing better.
I think we all agree, and not to put Cliff on his next soapbox, but the other one is, I mean, as a culture, we all need more exercise, we need more weight control, we need many more things contributing to general health. These are all things that we'd like to be able to give to our patients routinely, probably in every setting, certainly in this setting. And I think at least we can hope that we can raise the consciousness of physicians to be making that part of the management of these patients. You know, to expect that people are going to need proactive ways to deal with these side effects, because they are so common, and we don't want our patients to be giving up on the drug. Drugs work, so we need to find ways to help make sure they can take them. I think any kind of support, you know, it's just worry that in this environment there is so much more pressure on all of the healthcare systems. You know, you can talk about the doctors, but a lot of this stuff is now prescribed by the systems you work in. We need to make health and health maintenance part of treatment, not just managing illness.
Thank you.
And it's extremely disturbing when you do a study on exercise and you see that the median BMI is 29, which means that these are overweight individuals very close to being obese, one BMI point from being obese. So we all have to be responsible for ourselves first and foremost, and not expect the system to do things for us only, especially when it comes to diet and exercise. It's great when there's services out there. In Chicago, we have the wellness centers. They're actually offering exercise classes, and these are all free. But unless a woman is motivated to actually go to the wellness center or go somewhere else, you can give her anything you want, but you're still not going to do it. We have to be motivated ourselves.
But part of the other issue is that, you know, some of the medications that they give you wind up causing you to gain weight, whether it's tamoxifen, whether it's going through medically induced menopause. So that also needs to be taken into effect. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go over here to the next question.
Yes, hi. I want to thank all the doctors. I know they have such a difficult job to decide what to do. And I'm coming across this in a different way. I'm Susan Exler and involved with metastatic for a long time myself, since 2000, and I do all the activities with ACS and all the groups, and I'm listening almost to this, people stopping the AIs. Well, what happens is I was on mine for 11 years, and then I had no choice. It didn't work, so I'm really in awe of all the work on endocrine resistance. And I also remember years ago, and it was always the dormancy and latent gene. I really haven't heard that today. Here I heard about the mutations, which are really important, but there's also that gene that's sitting there. And that leads up to something that I was thinking about all as you were talking and throughout the day, was we always talk, let's give the women tamoxifen, let's start AIs, let's start them early. Well, what will happen? Will there build up something in the body that will resist it? Because there's only so many drugs you can take. So if they eventually start the drug at 31, you know, what's going to happen down the pike when they do get the cancer? Is this affecting it? So I'm really, what I wanted to know more about was that resistance of endocrine. Because I think it's
there's
serious.
a principle that helps with the complicated question you asked, and that is that it's true maybe under pressure of treatment some cancers develop resistance. But when we on this panel say yes, give everybody tamoxifen if they're 32, or yes, give everybody an AI if they're 55 and menopausal, we're not doing that and wondering what happens. That data is known. There are fewer recurrences and fewer deaths. And so you have to sort of accept that. Now, that doesn't mean But there won't be resistance, of course, in the subset who unfortunately still have relapse after that treatment, and that has a bearing on how we then treat them. But you have to always look at the whole population. The whole population clearly does better.
And that will probably also change as they learn more about it. And there's more
Or make
drugs
it better
out there,
selecting.
right there too. And you see everybody's personalized. But thanks again.
Okay, we'll do this one, and you, and then we're gonna have to stop. And you can come up and talk to me later. Go ahead.
Please.
Hi. I would like to thank you for your beliefs and statements and whatever you have said up to now, but especially what you said about the budget and the finances of health. I come from a country where we have 3 million and they have people who have lost their insurance, social security. We have very big financial problems. It's Greece. And in the last 5 years that we have the crisis, the life expectancy has dropped 3 years. I mean, they were 81 years old and now 78. And I think that's a genocide. I would like to say, it's not, I don't want to ask you something, but I would like to tell you something that I heard in a conference from an English professor, saying that when we talk about health and budget comes into talking discussions, then we lose our humanitarian aspect. And this is something that maybe you should use in whatever you tell to your government. And I think it's something that we all have to consider. Thank you very much.
Demian, I'm posting a question from one of the women in New York who's watching on the live feed. And she wanted to know that if we do the things to protect the bones with the biophosphates, what do you think that will do to the liver and the lungs? Do you think it will just move forward, or do you think there's going to be a stop?
To the what?
I'm going to read it again. One of the women in New York who's on the Twitter feed posted a question, and my phone is dying. What she wanted to know is if we do things to strengthen the bone with medication, what will that do then to bone, lung, liver? What do you think? What will happen past the bone? Would it move into the lung? Would it move into the liver?
Bisphosphonates will move.
So if it prevents disease in the bone.
So I think, I mean, when you look at the data, and that's what Dr. Garber was saying, there's a lot that we don't know. But when you look at that overall survival that is improved, I think in some of those women, what we're doing is we're curing some micrometastatic disease to the bone only. That's kind of my take. I'm curious to hear what everybody else thinks about that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any suggestion that if you're protecting the bone, that you're forcing the tumor to appear in other places. You know, where tumor goes to live is a very complicated biology of the tumor and the environment where the tumor can survive. And breast cancers have patterns of spread. So I think the good news, if this bisphosphonate thing is all real, is that by protecting against bone metastases, people did live longer. They eventually often do end up with disease elsewhere, but maybe it's at least later. But I don't think there's any suggestion from this that this will make the disease more aggressive and spread to other parts of the body.
There's actually a good example of this, which is, when trastuzumab Herceptin was originally out, I guess it was a few years afterwards, we were used to it, we started seeing more brain metastases. And the original thought was that, I remember some patient telling me, oh, but Herceptin causes brain metastases. And, what really happened was women just lived longer. And it was the natural history of the disease. And we've now shown that in lots of places. So I think it's the same idea that if one of the thoughts has been that they're always showing these pictures of one of our predecessors who talked about the seed and soil hypothesis, and the idea that you have to have an environment that provides structure and a rich sort of nutritional state for these cells to sit around and wait to grow back. So no matter where they're growing, they have to have been sitting around somewhere. So the idea is to attack the place where they're sitting around.
Excellent, thank you.
Good.
And you know what, I love it that this is our first time to have live streaming, and we got a call.
our mentors were truly exceptional tonight. I really enjoyed the dialogue.
Thank you.
I am, yeah. Yeah, it'll be on demand. I'm Todd.
Hi, I'm Michelle.
It'll be on demand. They can watch it at home. And they can get it from breastcanceranswers.com.
And that's for the live.
For the, yes, watch that. But I can.
So I'm going to get tomorrow night. Thank you, Dr.
Oh, I wasn't planning on doing it tomorrow, but yeah, we're going to text it for you.
Okay, sure.
And
For breast cancer
answers.com. We've been doing live broadcasts all week.
Right.
I can, if you want to give me your email address, I'll send it to you right now.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let me.
Okay, here's my. I'm not a fighter.
That's okay. I'll get a card outline. Donation back. I wonder if it's a donation back. I'm just gonna keep
Say hi. You're again.